Welcome back, orchestrators, composers. Today we're looking at the flute family, and these are a compilation of notes taken from your textbook, Blatter, also their contributions from the Sam Adler, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Donald Grantham. So let's get into it. The flute family. Properties of the flute, of course, you know already. Ouch! Highest pitch family of the woodwind choir. This is how we get into the upper range of the piano, let's say, or if we go into piccolo range, how we can ascend to the very top of the piano range. Of course, traditionally, historically, we're talking about a move from wooden-made instruments to instruments made of metal, which of course contributes to a louder sound overall, a more piercing sound in the modern orchestra. Flutes that I'll ask you to know, of course, the flute in C, which we just call flute. Piccolo also in C, but of course, as you already know from our transposition exercises, when a piccolo sees a middle C, for example, it will come out as an octave higher. When they see this note on their staff, it will come out an octave higher. That's our piccolo in C. I would like you to know the alto flute, which is slightly less common. But of course, in any professional orchestra or academic orchestra on a college campus, most likely at some point an alto flute will be called on. And that is in G, meaning that if they see a middle C, the resulting pitch will be a perfect fourth lower, meaning G, which is why we call it in G. Okay, and Sam Adler, world famous composer and orchestrator. I would encourage you to take a look at his orchestration book at some point. Reminds us that it's the only non-reed instrument of the woodwind choir. So that is of note. It does stand out as a non-reed instrument. And of course that just the properties of the instrument are different. The resulting sound is quite different. As we already talked about in the use of, let's say, tonguings, double tonguing, triple tongue, flutter tongue. These are all techniques that are easier for the flute. Okay, the range of the flute. This is important for your composition exercise coming up. And of course, for those of you who are education majors, you'll want to pay close attention. This is in your Blatter textbook to the elementary school versus high school range versus professional range. So I'll ask you to keep it within that elementary school range. And we're working within the NISMA guidelines. For those of you who are education majors, you'd want to work in that more limited range. For those working outside of that, you'd want to explore the professional range. Okay, and for the most part, you can see that the alto flute has the same written range as the flute in C, but of course the resulting sound will be lower. So of course the reason to use that alto flute would be more for the lower register and for the resulting tone. So we'll hear some examples of alto flute in class, and you'll see, yes, that's a much richer, darker sound. And of course the piccolo, take note that it has one less note than the traditional flute. And as we're about to see in another diagram, of course, I would say really all players in a college setting and certainly in a professional setting will have that extra B. So you can really think in terms of B below middle C all the way to high D. Of course, when we get into this higher range, you'll see that the dynamic contour is quite extreme. So you should be careful if you're writing a rangy piece and you really want those higher tones, or you're asking the instrumentalist to play louder in general. If you want a very high sound but played quietly, that might be a good opportunity for the piccolo, or a good reason to use the piccolo. That's not to say that they cannot play piano in higher ranges. It's just much, much harder. And when we're talking about the extreme, in this extreme range, really we're talking about forte, fortissimo, fortissimo, is more idiomatic in that range. And the reverse is true. Let's say you're hovering around that middle C. You would think this would be, we think of it as a very common range for, let's say, children's music. Well, actually, the resulting sound would be so wispy, quiet, and it would not pierce through an ensemble. So really, you'd want to think up an octave, let's say. That would be much more natural for a melody on the flute. Okay, things to avoid. You probably won't spend much time down here in the extreme low. It's quite easy on a piano. But as we'll see in class in a video, these trills are quite difficult, and that has to do with the fingering. So you want to avoid these trills. There's something to mark down as not to use in general. Does that mean you cannot play a chromatic scale or back and forth slowly? No, of course that would be fine. But quickly, that would be very awkward on the flute. And as we already said, the dynamic control diminishes in the high range. Be careful. Donald Grantham, well, I like to include these little descriptions because they're coming from different perspectives. He calls the extreme high range shrill. I think that's interesting, and I would agree, and certainly in most contexts, certainly if you want a shrill sound, that's an easy way to produce it. Rimsky-Korsakov calls this piercing. That's a slightly more positive way to put it. And he continues and says, well, this is not really for holding out better for punctuating a phrase. So let's say you had a group of woodwinds, right? They have a big flourish, right? If you want that high punctuating phrase versus you wouldn't want to hold out these extreme high notes for all that long. Okay, and as we already said, the extreme low is quite easily covered by other instruments, so be careful. It's not to say that you cannot write for it, but it is to say to be mindful of the fact that it's quite delicate. Okay, Rimsky-Korsakov. I love these. It's interesting looking back on these. Essentially, it's a historical document at this point because there have been improvements to the instrument, and of course, many pieces written which extend the range of the flute. But I think it's beautiful how he lays out the different ranges of each instrument. So I'll include these in our slides. Here you can see he thinks of different segments of the range as containing different qualities. So that low range is weak and whistling. We get into the mid range, soft, weak. This is the piccolo we're talking about, bright, clear, etc. So this might be something good to refer to. Let's say you write a piece and you say, wait, how will this sound? I don't have a friend who's a flautist, and I'd like to know how it would sound. You might consult this book and say, oh, am I hanging around in the right tessitura for the instrument? The tessitura meaning where it sits within the range. This is from Sam Adler. Again, same idea, although he has some different descriptors. Weak but luscious. Ooh, he sounds like he's about to write a short poem dedicated to the flute. Sweet but with a little carrying powder. Power, not powder, but power. Clear and brilliant. Certainly true. A bit shrill. Okay. And as he says, approach with extreme caution in the higher range, preferably stepwise motion. Okay. And of course, the reason for that, the reason that we're naturally louder when we're going higher. Well, that breath is being expended quite quickly. Think about it. There's no resistance for the instrument. The air is flowing past the head joint, right? There's no resistant pushing back, as opposed to, let's say, the oboe or bassoon, which is quite literally pushing back on the instrumentalists as they're breathing into it. In fact, it's more common for an oboist to have extra breath at the end of a phrase versus the flautist, who is probably out of breath. Oh, and this is to say, don't forget rests. Okay. Rests give the chance, of course, to breathe and relax the lips in between. So this is good advice. And anytime I'm done with a piece, orchestrating or composing, I'll look back through and say, okay, does everyone have something to play? And am I overtaxing any of my instruments? And that might be a good way to say, oh, you know what? I think I don't need the flutes here. They need a bit of a rest. Oh, I don't need the horns here. They certainly need more rest than others, than, let's say, the strings, who can play and play and play and not get too tired. Okay, and one way, let's say you want a continuous sound, and if you want that continuous sound, but you know that the instrumentalists need a breath, well, this is a great reason to use dovetailing, where you have one instrument taking over for another. Notice you have the second flautist taking over for the first flautist, and they go back and forth. By the way, I tend to say flautist, but you can also say flutist. Same thing. It's just historically the word that they tend to use. Piccolo is quite an agile instrument, just as the flute is. Here you have the flight of the bumblebee, right? All these chromatic passages, right? Right, quite easy for them to pass off. And of course, if we're talking about that F sharp, well, it'd be sounding up here. That's the highest F sharp on the instrument. Right? Okay, so the extreme range. Piccolo and tuba. Interesting. That's an interesting arrangement for this. The alto flute, I hope you have a chance to work with an alto flutist at some point. Remember that most flutists will double on the others. It's not to say that they all own an alto flute and they don't all own a piccolo, but certainly most of them have had experience playing both. Some tend to specialize more in the alto flute, however. It's thought of as slightly less agile, takes more air, it's a bigger instrument, and is slightly, of course, lower, darker, richer. We'll spend some time listening to alto flute in class. It is a beautiful instrument, and if you want that really low, rich, picture, let's say you did write a melody that's hanging around, let's say a typical children's range from C to C, the alto flute can really handle that range quite easily because they're not in their extreme low. So that's something to think about. Typical flute scorings here. I have two quite different things. Can You Feel the Love Tonight? Notice that this is at a nice sweet range of the flute. Try to picture that down an octave. Technically, they could play it. It would sound pretty, but it would probably be covered up completely by the rest of the orchestra. Here, at least, it has a chance. Right? This is a slightly more florid passage. Again, it's quite agile, rapid. This is from a piece that I wrote called The Fantastic Flute. Here, notice by slurring these two, I'm expecting the flautist to play this with double tongue. So you can see that I myself, when I'm representing these pieces, I'm often singing along when I'm composing or when I'm orchestrating or when I'm deciding, oh, what do I want the articulation to be? I'm often singing it. Here I wanted these angular lines punctuated by these extreme high notes. Do you see measure 17, measure 18? Right, and of course, sforzando, well, if the flautist is producing that note, it's most likely a sforzando because it's a very high jump upwards. And look at that extreme changes in dynamics and direction. It's a great instrument for just covering so much of their range quite easily. And of course, many flute solos, duets, and trios. We'll listen to these in class. The Edgar Varese. Here it's exploring that beautiful, low, sensuous. It's only the C sharp, but that's quite low. It only has 2 more notes to go, and then they're completely out of notes. Bizet, middle register again. It's very possible for the instrument to play pianissimo, but in its higher range. Try to picture let's say a soprano voice singing pianissimo in this range. It would be quite difficult, depending on the soprano. If you're a coloratura, perhaps that's simpler. Those with a lot of control and the high range, of course, but most vocalists probably would have a tough time singing a high E flat, but pianissimo. Well, not the flute here. It's quite natural for the instrument. Of course, if you took that up an octave, well, no, we're really talking about the extreme. By the way, the flute some flutists can play that high E flat. I would not ask for it though, unless you want to hear, it's like a gunshot going off. It's quite loud, and not all flautists have that note. So we're talking about a very virtuosic note. So as you can see, we're spending a lot of time thinking about range, what's appropriate for different parts of the range. Of course, you all know this passage. Look at this great run. And notice the first flute, arpeggio starting on D. Second flute, arpeggio starting on A. Third flute, arpeggio starting on F sharp. And of course, what's the result? Well, quite quickly, we cover all inversions of the D major chord, and it's a flourish, right? Essentially, that's what we get. That's the effect. So this is something it's technically playable on the piano, but the flautist can toss this off like it's no big deal, and it fits the instrument beautifully, and it's a great gesture towards the high range. Also, notice the grace notes there. We've talked about the use of the grace notes, trills, runs, fast scalar passages, fast arpeggios. These are all things that are very idiomatic for the flute. Okay, and excuse me, there we are. And we've also talked about the fact that, well, you can have single tonguing, double tonguing. Here we have triple tonguing, though it's not marked. It's expected at this speed. So you might spend some time practicing this. If you can perform it, they can perform it. Again, there are 3 different variations on triple tonguing, depending on which you prefer. I tend to say takata, 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 but any of those variations were plausible. Okay, and there again, look at that nice fluty trill with grace notes. Very, I think of those as almost, ribbons on a present, or let's say Christmas ornaments on a tree, or something to that effect. It's very effective on the flute, these decorations. Okay, and lastly, we're talking about dovetailing, but here you can see in the Borodin Polovitsyan dances that he's dovetailing between flute and piccolo. Interesting. So remember that this G the resulting sound would be an octave higher. And then when the flute comes in, it's as if the instrument continues. The color would change slightly, but it would be very subtle. And it's very easy to dovetail from one instrument to another. Notice dovetailing tends to mean dovetailing the same note. Sometimes I use that phrase a little bit more liberally, as in you're passing off the melody from one instrument to another, and they don't always have to play the exact note. But traditionally, we're talking about it's as if you have a relay race and you're passing the baton to the next person. What at some point they need to share. They're holding the baton at the same time. Okay, and here's a good example of the high register Beethoven Pastoral Symphony. Right, this is again making the case for a very agile instrument, and we can toss off these fast runs into, the flute does have a few more notes, but not that many. We're in the top, 5 notes now of the instrument, so we are getting into the more brilliant range up there. So that's good to keep in mind as you're writing for flute. Here's something you probably won't spend a lot of time with if you're a composer who's curious about more modern techniques. There are plenty of techniques to look up. And in fact, you might look up Robert Dick and all the amazing things he's done with multiphonics, activating different overtones. Flutter tonguing, though, I would say is not all that. It's really a common technique at this point. We used to call it an extended technique. At this point, I would not call flutter tonguing an extended technique. If you can go, then you can flutter tongue, and it's a beautiful sound, and it could be used in any number of contexts that don't necessarily have to be avant-garde. Okay, here are some examples of the brilliance in piccolo. I think we've made the point for brilliant sounding high music. The Penderecki. Okay, St. Luke's Passion. Okay, using the highest note possible. Bass flute. I won't require you to know the bass flute, but again, these are interesting excerpts. Okay, so there you have it. This is a good overview of flute basics. So if you'll refer to your assignment, I'll be asking you to compose a short melody. I say 8 to 16 measures. If you want to think a little bit outside the box and not just think of, you don't have to think in 4-measure phrases. If that helps you, certainly, that's great. The main thing I want you to consider, and this is really the point, is to start thinking like a composer and arranger who's concerned with, one, the range of the instrument. So you don't want to extend beyond that low B, right? If you wrote a B flat, F for you. Okay, but if you write that B or above, okay, you're in the range. High D. Okay, that leaves you a lot of notes in between. And, probably I would stay away from the extreme ranges. So you might say C to C, might be a little safer. So you have 1, 2, 3 octaves to deal with. If you're an education major, you want to keep that a bit more reserved. That low C is harder to produce when you're younger. So you might think of a melody maybe that's starting on D or a little bit above. Okay. And the other big thing I want you to think of is when you go higher, that it is louder. So you're thinking about the dynamic contour. Okay, that's all, folks. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I shall see you shortly.